I get emotionally involved with my patients when I'm looking after them one-to-one, and I have to do that in order to be an effective advocate for them. However, on the last Friday in the month, when I go to Ashford to our IFR panel, I leave my emotion at the door. And when I walk into that room, I am being an objective clinician, bringing whatever clinical skills I have to the decision making that is made. And therefore, I do not want to see emotion in that room, because I don't feel that emotion should be part of the decision making in which we're involved. My brief talk is going to have these four elements to it. What does their presence add? What does the presence of patients add? I'm going to talk about articulacy, advocacy and availability, objectivity, and then finally what I believe to be the inconsistency of the West Kent approach. So I am a passionate believer in patients being involved in decisions about their health, and I try, when I'm consulting with patients, to ensure that we do reach mutual decision making. I'm a passionate believer that the health service should be transparent, and it should be clear what processes and procedures are being followed. However, I don't believe that having the presence of patients involved in panels helps to add anything more to that. Can their presence change a decision? If the answer is no, clearly they shouldn't be there. It's disingenuous to invite them. If the answer is yes, through what way can that decision be changed by having their presence there? If it's because of some factual evidence, some evidence about their treatment which which has been failed to be presented to the panel so far, that's a failure of the presentation of the case. It's a failure of their clinician to have advocated for them. It's a failure to have gleaned all of the facts about the case before it's presented to the panel. If their presence is actually to bring an emotional content to the decision making, this is inappropriate. Although it's called an individual funding panel, the role of the panel is not simply to look at the individual needs of the patient. The panel has a wider role in order to determine whether treatments that are funded by the taxpayer through the PCT are effective and cost effective. And therefore, they have to have a view, the IFR panel have to have a view which goes beyond the best interests of the patients being considered. Money is limited, money has to be well spent, and for all money spent on IFR decisions, money cannot be spent elsewhere. And the PCT has an obligation to those patients who are not having their cases presented at IFR panels. I'm sorry, but as soon as a patient walks into an IFR panel, my objectivity is irreversibly influenced. It cannot be otherwise. I doubt any suggestion that panel members can remain objective when they see a patient before them. The evidence with which we're presented in East Kent is thoroughly anonymised. We do not know the gender, the age, the class, the race, or the religious belief of the patient that we're considering. And I believe that's right. As soon as a patient walks into the room, before they have spoken, I have an understanding of their age, their gender, their class, their race, their religion. And I'm sorry, that is inevitably going to have an impact on me. I am what I am. I'm a human being with emotions and feelings. It is basic transactional analysis that when a person is in the room, they are emotionally influencing what is going on in that room. And this cannot be appropriate. We cannot be making decisions that are anything other than objective. Therefore, that means that the articulate are going to favour the inarticulate. Those who have a good command of English are going to put their case better than those who do not have a good command of English. those who are used to speaking in public will inevitably put their case better than those who are not used to speaking in public. I cannot see how it can be otherwise. Availability. My prisoners will not be able to turn up to an IFR panel. The asylum seekers who I used to look after in Margate could not turn up to an IFR panel. They couldn't afford the bus fare to Ashford. And even when they got there, they would be so overawed by the panel and so unable to express themselves in English that they would not go there. But objectivity is lost, articulacy wins over, and people who are available are more likely to be able to put their case than people who are not available. The PCT has a right to treat all citizens equitably, equally. And this, the suggestions of having patients at panel is not equitable. I'm very concerned about the non-legal advocates that patients are permitted to accompany them and speak on their behalf. I understand that they cannot be lawyers, but there is nothing to stop them being members of patient groups, members of lobby groups, patient interest groups, or even, I would greatly fear, representatives from pharmaceutical companies who wish to have their drugs used and funded through an IFR process. And so, having said all of this, I cannot see how the obligatory equality impact assessment that would have been carried out in West Kent, I cannot see how it could have deemed that there were no issues of equality here. There have to be issues of equality. My final points are about inconsistency. The model used in West Kent is that applications for IFR funding are viewed by a group of people who are not the panel, and it is they who make the decisions about whether the case is potentially exceptional or rare. The patient is not present there. And therefore the point that Mr. Dorrington was making about his wife's exceptionality, he would not have been able to have made that point, because the fundamental decision about exceptionality and rarity is not being made by the panel. It's being made by a group of people who come before the panel, who I've called, slightly ironically, the proxy panel. Because indeed, if you've got more than one person there, you've got a panel in all but name. So the panel is only considering effectiveness and cost effectiveness. And I cannot see how having a patient coming at that point in the process can influence the decisions. Because if the decisions are about effectiveness and cost effectiveness at that stage, when the patient is presenting him or herself, it is too late to be arguing for exceptionality and rarity, and the precise details of how that patient's illness has affected them will not impact on decisions of the effectiveness of the treatment or the cost effectiveness of the treatment. I would also argue that it's slightly disingenuous to suggest that the model in West Kent is a model based on no decisions about me without me, because of course the decision is made without the patient. The patient is not there for the decision. My final point really is the inconsistency of having patients present at IFR panel decisions when individual patients with individual illnesses are not present at any other commissioning circumstance in the PCT. So when services for diabetes or high blood pressure or mental health or learning difficulties are being commissioned, patients are not there. So if there is a belief, no decision about me without me, we need patients, and we want that to be consistently applied through the PCT. Patients need to be there at every commissioning decision, and they are not. So in summary, I believe that processes should be transparent, and it should be clear to patients precisely how their IFR requests will be dealt with. Patients should be advocated for, and I believe it's my role as a clinician to ensure that I am the advocate for that patient. I would not be unhappy if a compromise was reached whereby patients could express details about their illness on paper, although I do find that the emotional content of letters influences and clouds my judgment. And I believe that for the reasons that I've just stated, although I understand that they're deeply held views in West Kent, I feel that on balance, the risks and the losses and the loss of objectivity outweighs the undoubted benefits that patients perceive by being involved in the process. Thank you.
My wife and I experienced the old secretive West Kent PCT procedure back in 2008. And after that, I was so angry and bitter that I wrote to them, and I was asked to work with them to put together a new patient-led IFR policy. And my objective of being here today is to persuade those of you who may have any doubt that patients in being involved in the IFR process is not the right way to go. And all I would say to you, bearing in mind, is the patients' lives that you are dealing with. And the West Kent PCT, in my view, is the only way that you can go forward. What I would do is go through the background of my wife and my experience. From that, we recognised the need for change, very much due to Julia and her team. The feedback that we got, the way that we went about it, and then acting on that feedback, how we brought together the new IFR policy. I'll then, right at the end, give you my reflections on the whole process, and then there is a short film that I will share with you, which we made for the NHS Alliance last year. My wife was diagnosed with bowel cancer in May in 2003, and having had all the standard chemotherapy treatment, which was available on the NHS at the time, she was advised by her oncologist to apply for a drug, cetuximab, which wasn't available on the NHS. And as part of a palliative care program, the oncologist did think that this could prolong her life, but more importantly, in that situation, would give her an improved quality of life. As I've already said, cetuximab was not NICE approved. So with the backing of the oncologist, we applied to West Kent PCT for funding on an exceptional basis. We were refused not once, but twice, because the IFR panel deemed my wife was not exceptional. Following requests and copies of the minutes of the meetings, it was obvious that the panel had not fully understood and had failed to investigate the history of my wife's case. And despite requests from us to attend the second meeting to put the wife's case, to make sure they knew all the details and all the background, we were refused any form of contact with the panel. We were convinced that we had a cast iron case, and therefore went forward on an appeal basis. And 4 months after we put forward the original request, we were granted funding on an exceptional basis. 4 months of my wife's life had been lost. 4 months that, and in her oncologist's opinion, could have improved the quality of life and possibly prolonged it. We will never know. We were angry, we were frustrated. And the fact that we were frustrated is, it's an understatement of what we felt. There were faceless bureaucrats, as far as we were concerned, that had certainly not understood the case, had not fully understood, and despite the fact that we'd written everything down, the communication obviously hadn't gone through. Patients could have no part in involvement in their decision making, and this has got to be totally wrong. It was as though we didn't exist, but it was my wife's life that they were dealing with. And in any court in the land, you are given the right to put your case verbally before being sentenced. in my view, is a fundamental human right. Why should the NHS be any different? Dealing with a terminal illness is stressful enough, but the additional stress of having to deal with a system which to us had no fairness, no transparency, and involved people who didn't have the courage to meet and face the patients on whose life they were having such a major impact was just plain wrong. And although a primary care trust in name, patient care was obviously no part of West Kent PCT. Fortunately, there were people within West Kent who cared. They accepted that their exceptional funding policy was in need of change and that patients needed to be treated with more sensitivity. They realised the whole process needed to be more open and transparent. And in February 2009, just 3 weeks after my wife had lost her battle with cancer, I met with Julia Ross, who asked me if I would put my anchor into action and join them. You bet your life I would. Join them by joining them on a design and reference group of West Kent PCT people involved in the IFR process. Also involved will be referrers who use the system, plus other lay people from the PCT Health Network. Our objective was to look at the key elements of the process, gather as many views as we possibly could from all interested parties, review the results, and from this design a new, more open policy with patients at the centre of the decision-making process. Information gathering was done via one-to-one telephone interviews with patients and clinicians who had used the old IFR system. We wanted to get as wide a perspective as possible. Group discussions with health workers and people from the other voluntary sections were held. And we got the views across the whole spectrum of health workers and interested parties from both within and outside the health system. And finally, in April 2009, we had an all-day conference where all of these things were aired, viewed, and everybody had their say. The key things that came out of these consultations were many. The one that I obviously was interested in was the IFR process. And from this, the main thing that came out was that patients should be involved at all stages by giving them personal support throughout the whole process via a designated IFR contact, by making sure the patient's case was fully represented and understood. People need to feel that their case is being made with conviction, and that conviction can only come from here, from the person. And although not all patients may want or need to attend, it should be their right to do so, either personally or via their appointed advocate. If necessary, patients should be supported in how they go about preparing for the IFR and accessing advocacy. That was one of the major points that came out. What about people if they can't get advocacy? And that comes from the PCT. Above all, the whole process must be open and transparent. Secrecy breeds mistrust and a feeling that one hasn't been given a fair trial hearing. And believe you me, as somebody that's been there, I can certainly endorse that 110%. However, what came out very clearly was that patients or their advocate would not be involved in the decision making. These must be clinically based and conducted in private. But importantly, any decision must be clear and justifiable. So, after some 9 months' work, a new IFR policy was adopted, which was easily understood, and information on it readily accessible by a new website all being sent out. A revised referral form has been devised, and this requires more information and clarity required from the clinician. One of the things we found with the old referral form was it was very limited, and there's a section for the patients to keep them informed, because that was the other thing. We didn't know what was going on. Nobody bothered to tell us. We were only the patient. Customer services team has direct contact with the patient from referral through each stage of the process. The customer service team also acts as a point of contact for all queries from the patient. They assist in accessing relevant information as necessary. They're a support help machine and on advising patients on their right to appear in person in front of the IFR panel or appoint somebody to represent them. All information is sent out at least a week before the IFR meeting, and patients are given a 10-minute slot to present their case. IFR panel members may ask questions for points of clarification, but patients or their advocates are not allowed to question the panel. Time and support are offered by the CST panel, both before and following the panel presentations. The decision is made by the IFR panel in private. There is an onus on the panel to ensure a relevant medical expert is at the hearing or contacted if there's still areas of uncertainty. One of the things that we found, or we believe, is because the panel didn't understand my wife's exceptionality, they hadn't even bothered to contact her oncologist. Nobody seemed to care, as I said before. To avoid any delay in the patient knowing the outcome, and that also is important, the outcome of the IFR panel's decision, both they and the clinician are informed of the decision at the same time. As far as my reflections, my involvement with NHS West Kent was born out of anger, a lot of anger, frustration, and a belief that people in the NHS didn't care. The development and implementation of the new policy shows they do care, are prepared to listen, and make changes for the betterment of patients. The government document Liberating the NHS clearly states the NHS will be more accountable to patients, and patients will be at the heart of everything we do. In my book, these are resounding endorsements of the IFR policy West Kent PCT adopted and has been using for the past 18 months. My wife fought to see change within the NHS, with patients having a greater say in decisions affecting them, and as a legacy to her memory, I'm here today to do my best to see the level of openness, transparency and patient involvement shown by NHS West Kent be adopted across the whole of the Kent and Medway cluster. I will close by showing a short film which made for the NHS National Alliance Conference last year, a film which I think shows very powerfully that patients need and indeed must be given the right to attend IFR panel meetings. Thank you.
When Goff Norrington's wife Sheila was dying from terminal bowel cancer, her oncologist recommended a drug they believed could extend her life by precious weeks, if not months. At first, her NHS trust refused to fund it and only agreed after the couple appealed. But Goff says they felt excluded from that decision-making process, as all communication had to be in writing, and they couldn't put their case in person.
If you go to a court of law in a criminal proceeding, you're either allowed to present yourself or represent yourself, or indeed have somebody represent you. And it just seemed fundamentally wrong that you couldn't put forward a case that was even more important than perhaps a court of law, because it was affecting your life.
The concerns expressed by Goff and others like him were already recognised by his PCT, NHS West Kent. But here the Trust is changing its decision-making process to make it more accountable and transparent. So in future, a patient or an advocate nominated on their behalf will be able to speak to the panel of NHS professionals considering their funding request. There'll also be greater clarity as to who can apply for funding and how the decision-making process itself operates. And patients will be told the outcome of the hearing at the same time as their consultant.
What we've heard when we've been talking to our patients is that they want to feel involved in the process. They want to understand how their decisions are being taken and have that explained to them. And we're hoping by including them in this process and giving them the opportunity to contribute right from the very start of the process, that we will be able to deliver that degree of openness and transparency that they're so clearly seeking.
Of course, each individual case for special funding must still be considered on its own merits, and not everyone will get the outcome they desire. So could involving service users in this way bring emotional pressures to bear on a decision-making process that requires sound judgment?
I think that dealing with individuals face to face who are in difficulty is something that is both intellectually and emotionally very challenging, but that's a challenge which we propose to meet with training and with sensitivity, because we think that allowing patients to make their cases to the panel in these cases, which, let's not forget, are there by the virtue of their very individual nature, is something which is likely to make our decision making better and to be seen as fairer.
And as with other health services where engagement has helped shape their delivery, the Trust consulted with patients, clinicians and other stakeholders before making these changes.
I was the first to criticise the PCT. I'd be the first to congratulate them. They were aware that the system perhaps wasn't producing what it should do. They have been prepared to listen. They've consulted very, very widely. So I think the whole thing is much more open, it's much fairer, and it's certainly far, far more transparent than it ever was before.